The servers powered up one Wednesday morning in December 2025 inside a building on the edge of a Toronto suburb that most people had driven past countless times without a second thought. It wasn't hidden, and the company hadn't tried to disguise it. It simply looked like any other industrial facility along that road. Flat roof, no windows at ground level, and a parking lot that was rarely more than a quarter full. But what was unfolding inside that building, and inside 17 others just like it being built across 5 Canadian provinces within the same year, was unprecedented in the history of the two nations that share the world's longest undefended border. For the first time since Confederation, the leading tech giants from the United States weren't choosing to build at home. They were choosing Canada, not as a backup or overflow option, but as a deliberate strategic choice. Understanding why Canada was positioned to offer what no U.S. state could match reveals why a senior New York infrastructure analyst called it the most significant industrial reversal since the Auto Pact of 1965. But to grasp that, you first need to see how the landscape had shifted. It started with a decision in Washington meant for a completely different purpose. Donald Trump slapped sweeping tariffs on Canadian aluminum, steel, softwood lumber, and automotive parts during the first weeks of his return to office. Not just one sector, but all of them, at once, with no prior consultation, no diplomatic nicety that decades of integrated trade had set as a minimum expectation. The stated goal was leverage. The effect was acceleration. Within 48 hours, tech executives in Seattle, San Francisco, Redmond, and Mountain View had a long-running calculation suddenly resolve. Canada had just become not a friendly neighbor, but a strategic necessity for every hyperscaler building the AI economy. Not just a place to consider, but a place to commit. Ottawa didn't respond in 3 weeks, 3 days, or even 3 hours. It responded with 3 months of precise preparation that made the eventual announcement seem inevitable. It wasn't inevitable, it was engineered. Consider the numbers, because numbers built everything that followed. In December 2025, Microsoft revealed the largest investment in the company's entire Canadian history. 19 billion Canadian dollars between 2023 and 2027, with over 7.5 billion coming in the next 2 years and new capacity expected online in the latter half of 2026. This wasn't a symbolic gesture or a memorandum. It was $19 billion in physical infrastructure entering Canadian soil from the company behind the operating system on more than 1.4 billion devices worldwide. Microsoft wasn't alone. Amazon, Google, and Meta collectively plan to spend $635 billion to $725 billion on AI infrastructure globally in 2026, a 67% jump from 2025's $381 billion. Most of that capital was earmarked for data centers, GPU clusters, and the power to run them. Canada, with its hydroelectric abundance, cooler climate that slashed cooling costs by up to 40% versus southern U.S. states, stable regulatory environment, and pre-existing sovereign compute strategy, was poised to claim a disproportionate share of this global surge. Its data center market, valued at $5.44 billion in 2024, was projected to hit $12.27 billion by 2030. That wasn't growth, it was transformation. At a 14.52% compound annual growth rate, Canada's data center sector was outpacing any comparable G7 market. Carney's strategy wasn't announced in flashy headlines. It was carefully sequenced. In March 2025, the government rolled out the $300 million AI Compute Access Fund, a direct subsidy ensuring Canadian small and medium enterprises could access GPU computing power without being priced out by bulk-consuming hyperscalers. This wasn't just tech policy, it was a sovereignty move, signaling that Canada was building its own AI economy, not just hosting foreign projects. Next, the sovereign AI compute strategy set the stage for large-scale Canadian data centers, keeping data under Canadian law regardless of whose hardware ran it. A call for proposals ran from January 15th to February 15th, 2026, with TELUS among the first operators advancing under this framework. Then, Canada and Germany signed a joint AI declaration and launched the Sovereign Tech Alliance in February 2026, signaling to U.S. hyperscalers that Canada was creating standards for the next generation of AI governance rather than waiting for Washington. Finally, the federal government invested in Cohere, the Toronto-born large language model company now scaling across enterprise markets in the U.S., Europe, and Indo-Pacific. Cohere's models went onto Microsoft Azure not as a minor addition, but as a featured enterprise offering. A Canadian AI product backed by the federal government was now running on the world's largest enterprise cloud for American customers. The servers powered up one Wednesday morning in December 2025 inside a building on the edge of a Toronto suburb that most people had driven past countless times without a second thought. It wasn't hidden, and the company hadn't tried to disguise it. It simply looked like every other industrial facility along that road. A flat roof, no windows at ground level, and a parking lot that was rarely more than a quarter full. But what was happening inside that building, and inside 17 others just like it being commissioned across 5 Canadian provinces within the same 12-month period, was something that had never happened before in the history of the two countries sharing the longest undefended border on Earth. For the first time since Confederation, the most powerful technology companies in the United States were not building in the United States. They were building in Canada, not as a backup plan, not as an overflow arrangement, but as a primary strategic decision. And once you understand what pushed that decision forward, and what Carney positioned Canada to offer that no American state could match, you understand why a senior infrastructure analyst in New York called it the most important industrial reversal since the Auto Pact of 1965. That phrase, and the full weight behind it, is coming. But first, you need to understand just how completely the landscape had changed. It began, as so many shifts of this size do, with a decision made in Washington that was meant to accomplish something else entirely. Donald Trump imposed sweeping tariffs on Canadian aluminum, steel, softwood lumber, and automotive parts in the opening weeks of his return to office. Not one category, not one targeted sector, but all of them at the same time, without advance consultation, without even the basic diplomatic courtesy that 50 years of integrated cross-border trade had established as the minimum expected standard between the two countries. The stated goal was leverage. The actual result was acceleration. Because within 48 hours of those tariff announcements landing on the desks of technology executives in Seattle, San Francisco, Redmond, and Mountain View, a calculation that had been quietly running in the background of every major infrastructure planning meeting suddenly became clear. Canada had just become, in the minds of every hyperscaler building the AI economy, not a friendly neighbor, but a strategic necessity. Not a place to think about, but a place to commit to. Ottawa's response did not come in 3 weeks, not in 3 days, not in 3 hours. It came through 3 months of careful, surgical preparation that made the announcement, when it finally arrived, look inevitable. It was not inevitable. It was designed. Consider the numbers, because the numbers became the architecture of everything that followed. Microsoft announced the largest investment in the history of Microsoft Canada in December 2025. Not the biggest investment in a single quarter, but the largest in the company's entire Canadian history. 19 billion Canadian dollars committed between 2023 and 2027. More than $7.5 billion of that arriving in the next 2 years alone, with new capacity scheduled to come online in the second half of 2026. That is not a partnership announcement. That is not a memorandum of understanding. That is $19 billion of physical infrastructure being poured into Canadian soil by the company that controls the operating system running on more than 1.4 billion devices worldwide. And Microsoft was not alone. Amazon, Google, and Meta together committed to spending between $635 billion and $725 billion on AI infrastructure globally in 2026, a 67% increase over their 2025 spending of $381 billion. Most of that capital was aimed at data centers, GPU clusters, and the power infrastructure needed to run them. Canada, with its abundant hydroelectric power, its cooler climate cutting cooling costs by as much as 40% compared with Southern American states, its politically stable regulatory environment, and its sovereign compute strategy already in place, had positioned itself to capture a larger share of that global wave than anyone expected. The Canadian data center market, valued at $5.44 billion in 2024, was on track to reach $12.27 billion by 2030. That is not growth, that is transformation. At a compound annual growth rate of 14.52%, Canada's data center sector was expanding faster than any comparable infrastructure market in the G7. What Carney did to place Canada in front of that wave was not announced all at once. It was sequenced. First, in March 2025, the government launched the $300 million AI Compute Access Fund, a direct subsidy tool designed to make sure Canadian small and medium-sized businesses could access GPU computing power without being priced out by hyperscalers buying it in bulk. This was not just technology policy. It was sovereignty policy. It told every global infrastructure operator that Canada was building a domestic AI economy, not simply hosting a foreign one. Second, the Canadian Sovereign AI Compute Strategy created the framework for large-scale sovereign data centers, facilities where Canadian data would remain under Canadian legal jurisdiction, no matter which company's hardware was running it. A call for proposals ran from January 15 to February 15, 2026, with TELUS among the first major operators to move forward under the framework. Third, Canada and Germany signed a joint AI declaration and launched the Sovereign Technology Alliance in February 2026, a bilateral framework that immediately showed American hyperscalers that Canada was building the standards architecture for the next generation of AI governance, instead of waiting for Washington to build it for them. Fourth, and most importantly, the federal government finalized its investment in Cohere, the Canadian-born large language model company founded in Toronto, now operating at scale across enterprise markets in the United States, Europe, and the Indo-Pacific. Cohere's models were then placed on Microsoft's Azure platform, not as some small addition, but as a featured enterprise offering. A Canadian AI company, backed by the Canadian federal government, was now running on the world's largest enterprise cloud. The customer was American. The product was Canadian. In the infrastructure planning meetings that followed Microsoft's December 2025 announcement, meetings that included officials from Global Affairs Canada, the Ministry of Artificial Intelligence and Digital Innovation, and the offices of 3 provincial premiers, one phrase started moving through the room because it explained the whole shift better than any official statement could. They needed the land. It was not a polished trade policy summary. It was not some carefully worded diplomatic line. It was a blunt description of physical reality, spoken by a senior provincial economic development official who had spent 18 months talking with American hyperscaler site selection teams. They came to us because they needed the land, the power, and the stability. And we had all 3. That line spread through the policy world the way true observations usually do. Not because it sounded elegant, but because it was accurate. Trump had tried to turn Canada into a dependent. Instead, he had turned Canada into a landlord. He had tried to pressure Canada's economy through the southern border. Instead, he pushed the richest companies on earth to build inside Canada's borders. He had tried to make Canadian sovereignty look like a weakness at the negotiating table. Instead, he made it the strongest feature on the investment prospectus. They needed the land. There is one principle that survives every tariff schedule, every trade threat, and every cross-border confrontation performed for domestic politics. The country that controls what the next economy runs on controls the next economy. Not necessarily the country with the largest military, not the country with the loudest voice, the country with the power, the land, the stability, and the governance framework that the builders of the future cannot find anywhere else. Canada did not chase this position. It did not have to. Geography, energy abundance, political stability, and a sovereign AI strategy built before the crisis arrived all came together at the exact moment the crisis hit. So when the hyperscalers went searching, Canada was the only place that had everything they needed at the scale they needed it. The checks are being written now, the facilities are being built now, the servers are going live now in buildings on the edges of suburbs that most people pass without ever noticing. What is happening inside those buildings is the foundation for the next 20 years of the global economy, and it is happening in Canada. Trump tried to make Canada smaller. Instead, he handed it the deed. They needed the land. Please hit the bell icon and subscribe to my channel for daily updates.